Hi, welcome to the Small Shed. This week I want to have a look at the inspirational car for my Cyclecar build. See you in a minute. Now, it's usual with the Cyclecar build, the first thing you do is choose an inspirational car, and in my case it's the Austin 7 twin cam single seat racers that were started in around 1936 I think and ran through to the late 30s. And I think I've probably got a claim to having a much closer relationship with my chosen car than many who just tend to look at something and think, oh, that looks nice, I'll build that. If we go back to Austin, who built the racers, I was born and brought up within a couple of miles of the Austin Longbridge factory and used to every day hear the steam hooter that went off the bull at lunchtime and going home time. You could hear it from our house and set your clock by it. So Austin is there, pretty much ingrained into the blood. My dad opened a garage just after the war in Northfield and was an agent for Austin and then BMC, so there's a connection through that. My very first photographs we've got, or some of the very early photographs of me, are in an Austin leaning over the bonnet helping Dad at the age of about 3 trying to mend the engine, so in the old A40. So again, first car I ever worked on was an Austin. Now when I was about 7 I think it would have been, the school took us all up to the Austin where they'd got a course laid out for teaching road safety, and we all drove around in J40 pedal cars, and I think somebody must have spotted the madness in my driving even at that age and asked me if I wanted to come back on Saturday where they had a race on, and I won that one, and won a, of all things connected with Austin, I don't know why they gave away it was an MG as a prize, but it was like a little remote control in those days being a long flexible piece of wire with a steering wheel on the other end. But so that was my first competitive motorsport event, was in an Austin, and that was something I still remember to this day. So that sort of sets the tone of that, and then we move on to the Austin 7 connections. In about 1962 I think it was, Dad brought home, or I went with Dad and picked up an Austin Chummy, a 1930 Austin Chummy that was in pieces effectively. It was a basket case, and I spent all of my early teenage years sitting in the garage on the bench helping Dad at night when he was working on the car, from I think it was about 62 through to 65, 66 time when it finally got registered and we started to use it. That car then went on to teach my brother to drive. It was intended originally as a car for my mum, but that was something that by the time it was finished she'd got a new Mini, so that was something that was left as a spare car then. So my brother learnt to drive on it, drove it, and then he got into Austin 7s. He had a Pearl Cabriolet and a 1931 or 32 saloon that he built. And then when I got to the age of being able to learn to drive, I learnt to drive on the Chummy, and that was my car until I was about 21, 22, something like that. And at that point it was getting that I was driving around so much it became more or less untenable to be driving something that old and doing that sort of mileage without some consequences mechanically. So I ended up getting another car, and then at that point there were 6 or 7 cars in the family, so something had to go, and sadly it was the Chummy. So the Austin 7s go pretty deep with me. I learnt pretty much all I know about cars and motoring and motorsport from being out and about with Dad, going to Prescott Hill Climb, which is probably only about 20 miles away from where we are now, Shelsley Walsh, and working on Austin. When I finished school at 19, I got a part-time job in the summer holidays before I started a proper job. So for about 2 weeks I went with a firm that were doing industrial cleaning at the Austin. It was somebody that my dad knew through the garage, and he gave me a job. So you could say my first job was working for the Austin, and again I spent a very happy couple of weeks up there in the late 1960s. So you might think, well, what's that got to do with the single-seater Austin twin cam? Why don't you build an Austin 7 Nippy, which my dad had, and got a photograph of Mum sitting in that in, again, early 1940s, I think. So Dad had the Nippy. It's interesting to note that the Chummy, the Nippy, my brother's Pearl and his saloon are all still on the road, registered and running, and hopefully next year I might catch up with a couple of them. So why the single-seater? Why the twin cam racer? Well, in 1943 the government recognised that the miners had a pretty hard job of it throughout the war, and it was causing major problems with lung disease and things like that. And so they encouraged industry to set up factories to help and occupy miners that had to retire through ill health. Leonard Lord, who is the chairman of Austin at the time, set up a factory in Bargoed in Wales, and the intention was to make children's pedal cars using scrap materials from the production line at Long Bridge. I think in time it got to the point where they were actually just using their own materials, but that was the original intention, and employ the miners. And the most famous of all those cars that they produced was the Austin J40, the little thing that you see on a lot of the fairgrounds. They're now collector's items worth an awful lot of money. But before that, for 2 or 3 years, they produced what they called the Pathfinder, which was a single seat model of a twin cam. And my brother first, and then me, had and rode around, pedalled around the streets in Northfield in one of those. So again, the argument is that was my first car, the Austin 7 twin cam single seater, albeit in model form. But then again, what am I making now but the same thing? So I think you can see that it's sort of in fairly deep with me. It's got to be an Austin, it's got to be an Austin 7, and it's got to be a single seat twin cam. Now all my cars have always had names. I've always sort of named them alphabetically since I had them. From the first Austin 7 through, the second one was the Ford 100E I bought from my sister-in-law, which was Bertha, and so it went on through the cars up to it's funny, the firm's cars I had were always male, and they were always blokes' names or boys' names. The females were always my cars that I'd bought, but I don't quite know why, but that was the way it turned out. And we got up to the point where my JZR in the garage, it came up to H, that's Henrietta, and the red Ferrari replica that's away still being dealt with a year on, being rebuilt, was Isabella. I call it Bella, but it's Isabella effectively. And then the Skoda I've got now is a J, so that brings me up to a K. And again, that's where my love of circularity, coincidence and all sorts of things like that comes in. The Austin single-seater racer teams, where originally there were 3 twin cam racers. Prior to that there had been Austin 7 single seat racers in the team that were a normal side valve engine. And what happened, one of the twin cam racers got wrecked very early on, so they only ended up with 2 in the team. And they started to race one of the side valve engine cars as well. And that was driven for an awful lot of its life by one K. Peter. That was spelt P-E-T-R-E, not as my name Peter. But the coincidence of having a K and a Peter again pulled me into the Austin 7 team, works team, and this car will be known henceforth as K. With regards to colour of the car, the twin cams started out white when they were first sort of introduced to the public, and indeed my Pathfinder was white, so there is an argument that it should be white, but in later years they turned to being painted British Racing green, and the single seat side valve racer was blue. And I sort of been playing in my head with what colour this should be. I quite like the blue. But I think I'm coming down on the side of British Racing green, and that is likely to be the colour that we will do it in. Now, as a reference point, I'm very lucky in that both the single-seater blue side valve car and the twin cam, well, all 3 cars in the team survived, but one of the twin cam racers and the side valve car, the blue one, are in the British Motor Museum at Gaydon. That is again about 40 miles away from me, and it's about 4 miles away from the railway club I go to, which is Kenilworth Warwick Way. So I can pop in at any time I want to and photograph it and look at it and pick up bits and pieces of detail from it. So I'm lucky as well that I've got something I can get up close and personal with.
They're hitting it up, running flat out, going great guns, heading for victory with a pace that thrills. And often as not, the Austin 7 sets the pace, swelling a roaring hymn to the god of speed. Listen to it. But where it all begins, there's a far different scene. For the building of a miniature racing car, such as the overhead valve Austin 7 Special, requires skillful planning and the application of intense research and wide experience. Only after long and careful calculations can performance be visualized and designing begin. Every detail must be correct. The problems involved of stress, strain, momentum and inertia are no ordinary ones when a baby car of 120 horsepower is travelling at as many miles per hour. The finest resources of Longbridge, the birthplace of the baby car, are applied to the building of this miniature speedster. The crankshaft is turned from the solid bar, requiring no less than a month of careful work for this component alone. The engine cylinder head has its combustion chambers machined with equal care. The camshafts are in themselves wonderful examples of machining perfection. Indeed, every machined surface has to be finished with exceptional accuracy to give speed, and even more speed. After machining comes verification of every vital dimension. The parts are measured, weighed, and balanced. When it comes to the pistons and combustion chambers, polishing by hand, most carefully, is the only finish permissible if international records are to be attacked. As assembling begins with fitting the crankshaft, we begin to realize the cleverness of the design, which provides for every predictable load within such compact dimensions. After the crankshaft, the cylinder head with valve gear, and then the supercharger. This engine begins to look like business. Will it give the revs? Will it give the power? The engine test will provide the answer. 8,000 RPM, 120 horsepower and more. 1 to every 1.5 pounds of engine weight. How's that for 744 cc? Slightly less than the capacity of your own Austin 7. At last we begin to see a car take shape. The axles, in themselves triumphs of engineering skill, bristling with studs and bolts, are assembled and installed. The car acquires its limbs, the wheels are fitted. 101 requirements are scrupulously fulfilled. Into the chassis, the engine and gearbox are carefully fitted. Special in every detail of design, but nevertheless the product of the same skill and experience that goes to the building of your own dependable car. The streamlined petrol tank forms part of the body structure, and then the shapely tail is added. At last, with the bonnet in place, the Austin 7 Special becomes recognizable as that great little car, that miracle of steel on wheels, which has contributed so much to the interest of motor racing in all the leading events. Let's see it at speed and hear it on track and road. All the crack drivers, all the latest and fastest cars compete in the many events that are run off each racing season at Brooklands, the world's first motor racing track. Brooklands, Mecca of the racing motorist, is a concrete circuit 2 3/4 miles in length, on which the Austin 7 is often prominent. When the cars roar past on the banking and the going is fast and furious, Brooklands provides its greatest thrill. you ever seen a road race on the Isle of Man with cars shooting like rockets from side streets onto a tortuous route? Round the houses, they call it, but it often threatens to become through the houses, as each driver tries to cut the corner and catch the man ahead. Here, footless steering and powerful braking are essential. The 7 in this event found the road surface treacherous, but after hitting the bank, whoa, what a bump, was soon away and reeling off the laps. Here indeed is the pace that thrills. How many times has the Austin 7 thrilled the huge crowds at Shelton? A difficult question to answer. But whenever cars are streaking up that famous hill, snaking around its treacherous bends and opening up with a deafening roar on the finishing straight, the 7 will be in evidence, putting up a fine performance. Shelsley Walsh is an international climb. The hill is 1,000 yards long, with an average gradient steeper than 1 in 9, and a maximum of 1 in 6. What a climb. The only track in England for road racing is Donington Park, where many of the most important events in the racing calendar are now held. The complete circuit is over 2.5 miles in length and winds through picturesque woods. For exciting racing, this track is now famous. And the Austin 7 has done its share, more than its share, in thrilling the crowds at Donington. Very different indeed is the tense atmosphere when international records are in the making. Apart from mechanics and officials, the electric timing apparatus is the only observer, but it misses nothing, not even a split second, as the 7 crosses the line at amazing speed. The career of a miniature racing car is indeed a fast and furious one. The Austin 7 Special sets the pace that thrills, a pace that brings achievement.
It's a real family affair, as with so many. And here is Francesca Wilton with a little K. Peter, Austin 7. Rep, here it comes, up towards the top. 750cc, in the style of the monoposto cars that competed very successfully in the 1930s. So Francesca Wilton in her early 20s, leaning nicely out of the monoposto.
It's the wonderful sight of all three Works Austin single-seater races from the 1930s back together.
So that's it, that's the Inspirational Car, 1935 Austin 7 twin cam single seat racer. And I would suspect that there's probably nobody got much of a closer connection with their Inspirational Car than I have in the cycle karting world. So that's where we're going with it. Next week I'm going to start and look at getting some drawings sorted out and see how it's all going to work. So I hope it's of interest. Look forward to seeing you next time. I'll see you then. Bye.